Adam Bandt, welcome to the program.
Hi, David.
So will the Greens support or oppose the government in legislating this 43% target?
It's too early to say at the moment. We'll wait and see what the ultimate legislation looks like. We've seen some leaked legislation this week and there's some problems with that perhaps we'll get a chance to talk about. We've got a number of senators who have only just taken up office, 1st of July. We're getting together as a group for the first time next week to sit and we'll start discussing including this legislation. And then, we still haven't had Parliament sit yet. There'll be a Senate inquiry and so on. So we'll look at the government's legislation. Our approach is to say to government, it's good that we're finally taking action on climate, but we need to do better. We've heard that from the Pacific Islanders this week. We're hearing it from the scientists. So we're up for talking. We're up for moving. We're up for shifting. It's going to take two to tango to get legislation through the Parliament, and so we want to have some good faith discussions with the government.
You just said there's leaked legislation. What do you mean leaked legislation? Weren't you provided with the draft legislation on Thursday?
Well, I think a journalist tweeted that they'd seen the legislation.
What about you?
Been out there.
Weren't you given the legislation?
We've been briefed on the legislation.
Right, so you've seen the legislation?
Yeah, and there's a number of problems with it at the moment. It potentially puts a ceiling on the ambition. It means that potentially if a future government wanted to lift the 43% target, they might have to come back to Parliament. So, imagine a change of Senate that gives Pauline Hanson in the future veto over a future government. It's probably not a genuine flaw. A future government might actually be able to put in a commitment to the Paris Agreement that's lower than 43%. And so if you're going to legislate, you want to Dutton-proof it. It doesn't contain any provisions that will stop coal and gas. And also, it's in many respects, as some commentators have said, it doesn't actually compel the government to do anything. So there's nothing in there that says this is how we're going to cut pollution. All right. So all of those things are
let's go through those
we
things.
think we want to work through.
There's a few interesting points there. So the first point you've just said, it creates a ceiling rather than a floor. Now, the government says to me that's rubbish. It does the opposite. Tell me how you're reading. What is it in the wording of the legislation you've got that says it creates a ceiling?
It locks in 43% in law, and it says the government could then go and announce a further target later, and they're going to need to, and we're going to push the government even during this term of Parliament to lift the target. But if they do announce that higher target, that doesn't update the 43%. The 43% remains stuck in law, and you'd have to come back to Parliament to change that 43%.
Which you could do.
Yes, but what if there's a new Senate? Why should you have to? This government didn't have to come to Parliament to announce its target.
So could you change the wording to say, just on this point, could you change the wording to say at least 43% or have some form of wording that would satisfy your concern?
I think it's a fixable problem.
Right.
I think it's a fixable problem. And this is where it comes into how we want to approach this. And we're saying to the government, we would go into discussions without preconditions.
So that could be that issue could be, just sticking with this one, that could be a wording change. There's room for compromise on the wording there to get around your concern on that 43% being a ceiling.
Well, there's a number of things that we do think that could be fixed. There's it being a ceiling, it being a floor. Big issues. Is the legislation going to force the government to actually do anything to cut pollution, or is it just a symbolic statement? And then secondly, what about new coal and gas projects? And this, for us, is a critical one. If we're negotiating something in Parliament on a Monday, and then on Tuesday, and we pass it, and then on Tuesday, the government turns around and says, oh, by the way, we're now going to open the Scarborough Gas Project in Western Australia, and Beetaloo. Beetaloo alone in the Northern Territory could add 13% to the emissions. That's not factored into the government's 43%
And I'll come back to
modelling.
the Beetaloo Basin because I'm interested in your point there. But on that, is that something that you can deal with separately to this climate legislation, the target legislation, the 43%, or are you going to stress and demand that all of these issues around no new coal and gas be included in this particular legislation?
Well, they're obviously linked, right? What are we talking about? We're talking about reducing pollution. Coal and gas are the biggest sources of pollution, and we can have a discussion potentially now, potentially over the next 3 years, about how quickly we get out of coal and gas. What should the targets be? The Pacific Islanders are saying what Australia's doing is good, but not enough.
But do you do that as part of this debate, or a separate debate?
But this is the key issue. We're doing this because we want to cut Australia's pollution, right? That is why we're having these discussions. Now, you don't put the fire out while you're pouring petrol on it.
No, I understand.
And if the government's, this is why they are linked, because if we're negotiating climate legislation, then this government has to now that they're in power, has to grapple with the question of, are they going to open up more coal and gas projects?
Yeah, and
because it could potentially blow the 43% out of the water. Like one of those projects could blow 43%.
And as I say, I'll come back to that, and I understand the point you've made on that, and you campaigned on that, and you had a very good election result based on your campaign on that. But my question is that something you will demand as part of this 43% target legislation, or can that be dealt with separately?
Well, we have to have, at the moment we're not even at square one, because the government is saying, you know, take it or leave it. You heard the Prime Minister during the course of the week. You've heard some of them that they're very clear. It's like there's no room to move on our level of climate ambition. We're saying that's not our position, right? We're saying we'd be willing to go and have discussions with the government, but these are the things that have got to be on the table. We're not going into it, as you say, with ultimatums, right?
Okay, so
we're going into it to say...
Because I just want to be clear about this. I'll just ask this one more time. That issue that you've got about no new coal and gas, that can be dealt with separately to this legislation of the 43%?
We would say it doesn't make sense to, because if we're about to negotiate
so that's a bottom line for you?
Well, I'm not talking about bottom lines and ultimatums, but you can't even have this discussion if the government is saying it's my way or the highway, which is where, with respect to the target, where they're at the moment. Now,
they've given you the legislation, you know, and you're raising your criticisms about it very publicly already. I just want to be clear about whether this is a demand for the Greens or whether you can pass this legislation and keep debating about those other issues.
We're saying we want to have a discussion about it. Now, at the moment, the government's saying they're going to barrel on with more coal and gas. We're concerned about that, right? We're saying we want to have a discussion about it. Now, if the government came to us and said, look, there's a different way that we can approach this question of opening new coal and gas, we'd be all ears, right? But at the moment, we're not even at square one, because the government is saying that they want to keep opening new coal and gas projects. And I think whilst people will have differences of opinion about what the target should be and how quickly we get out of coal and gas, I think there would be near universal agreement in the Australian community that we don't make the problem worse. We don't open up new coal and gas projects while we're trying to cut.
Well, I'm not sure if there'd be near universal agreement on that. I think that would be somewhat contested. But just to be clear on this legislation before we move on, if they can fix the wording or amend the wording around making sure it's not seen as a ceiling, 43%, and give you some sort of assurance that we'll talk about the future of coal and gas down the track, would that be enough?
Well, as I say, so four issues. It can't be a ceiling.
Yep.
We want to have a genuine floor. We don't want governments to be able to go backwards. Is it going to make the government do anything, or is it largely symbolic? And what about coal and gas? They're the issues that we want to put on the table. We'll put them on the table in a good faith way. But there has to be an end to the approach of it's my way or the highway. Otherwise, it's going to be a very long 3 years. Okay. It's going to be a very long 3 years if no one is willing to shift.
How important in principle is legislating a target, do you think? I mean, does it, you know, the argument from the government would be that it creates certainty for business and for investors, makes it harder for a future government to lower the target. Does it matter having it legislated? Well,
it depends what's in the legislation, doesn't it? I mean, if it is essentially only symbolic and doesn't do all of those things that you've said, then it might be less important than having something in legislation that actually says, look, we're heading upwards, we're going to provide some certainty and we're going to tackle coal and gas, which are the big causes. It really depends what's in the legislation.
And do you accept that Labor has a mandate? It won a majority in the House, won government in its own right. It was very clear about 43%. Does it have a mandate?
Well, it's got a mandate to get legislation through the House, but let's look at what happened in the election. Labor's vote went backwards. The Coalition's vote went backwards. The parties and independents whose vote went up were the ones who said, we've got to stop opening coal and gas. The government, we now have a situation where less than 1 in 3 people in this country voted for the government, okay? And in the Senate, the government does not have a majority. So whilst they might have a mandate to get their legislation through the lower house, the numbers dictate that, when it comes to the Senate, we're going to have to work together. I think a very clear message from this Senate, where you've got the biggest ever representation of non-government and opposition voices that we've ever seen, where the Greens vote, where a record number of people voted for the Greens. And how do you win a government when your vote goes backwards? You win it because a number of people voted for the Greens and preference.
Well, that's true.
That's a very clear message. Do better on climate.
Do you think the message, though, from this election was that the Australian people don't want to legislate a 43% target?
I think the message from this election is take action on climate. And people want us to work together to take action on climate. Now, we've just seen with the pandemic payments, for example, a government responding to changing circumstances. And we support that. Like, that is what you need to do. Just this week, the Pacific Islanders have said, we're glad that Australia's back at the table, but if you want to work with us, do more. So, tackle coal and gas. Like, those circumstances are changing as well. And increasingly, especially if we end up hosting a climate summit here, which I hope will, the pressure internationally for Australia to stop opening new coal and gas projects will be very significant.
Bottom line,
that's what they want us to act on.
Bottom line, are you really willing to sit on the side of the chamber with the Nationals and the Liberals and vote against this target?
Well, my hope is it doesn't come to that, right? My hope is it doesn't come to that because the government is able to sit with us and we can come up with better legislation. Our preferred approach, our strongly preferred approach, is to improve and pass. But if the government says it's our way or the highway, then we're going to have to respond to that.
So you could sit with Barnaby Joyce, with Peter Dutton, and vote against this?
That's our strong approach, our strong preference, is to work with the government to get good climate legislation passed. And if the government's willing to sit down and talk, we are too.
Okay, a couple of other related matters. We know the Greens want a climate trigger on environmental approvals. Is that something that you'd like to raise as part of this conversation, or will you deal with that separately?
Well, there's something wrong with Australia's environment laws where you can open up new projects and not have to think about the impact on the climate. And that's what the climate trigger, so-called climate trigger, is about. It's about saying, if you're going to go ahead with big new developments, do you take into account whether it's going to make climate change worse? At the moment, the laws say no. That has to be fixed, right? That has to be fixed. And that is something we've been pushing. That is something we will continue to push. Whether it's as part of this, whether it's future, that's something we're going to have discussions about as a party room. So we will have more to say about that question of how you make sure the impact on the climate of new approvals of new coal and gas is taken into account.
And on the Beetaloo Basin, which you've mentioned, this is a big concern for you, opening up a new gas field in the Northern Territory. Would it not be covered by the safeguards mechanism that the government, the new government's pledged to tighten? And wouldn't it also, as part of the Territory government's response to the Pepper inquiry into fracking, wouldn't it also have to be carbon neutral, offset?
Well, maybe, but look at what happened in Western Australia under a Labor government. The Environmental Protection Agency came out and said, if we're going to open up new gas projects, it's all got to be offset and it's all got to be carbon neutral. And the Labor government came in and said, no, we're going to override that, we're going to give you a free pass and you can keep on polluting and open up these new projects.
So you don't believe the Territory government when they say that?
Well, the Territory government, the Northern Territory Labor government, since the election, has already come with its hand out to the federal Labor government saying, can we have public money, taxpayers' money, used to open up the Beetaloo? And so that's going to be a test for the federal Labor government as well. What we're learning very clearly is Labor is hell-bent on opening new coal and gas projects. Part of the Greens' job is to try and push them and say, if we are in a climate emergency, which we are, and the government has just agreed to this week, in an emergency, you don't make the problem worse. You don't put the fire out while you're pouring petrol on it.
Adam Bandt, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, David.